I'm Nick from PowerBoatSupply.com. This is our MerCruiser Exhaust Buyer's Guide for boats with MerCruiser engines from the year 1986 to 2010. Some of the things we're going to cover today are: when should you consider replacing your MerCruiser exhaust parts? What are some early warning signs of potential failure? What's the difference between wet joint and dry joint exhaust? How to find the right parts for your MerCruiser engine, and we're going to break it down by each engine model. And what brands and parts do we suggest using? Exhaust parts are one of the most important maintenance items on your MerCruiser engine. Failure of an exhaust part could be catastrophic for your motor. Mercury Marine suggests replacing your exhaust every 5 to 7 years. But conditions are really important here. A saltwater boat that's used almost every day could need new manifolds every 3 years, while a freshwater boat that's a weekend boat might only need new exhaust parts every 20 years or almost never. So how do you know when it's time to replace your manifolds? Let's go over some early warning signs. The first sign to look for is any rust or seeping around the area where your riser meets the manifold. This could mean as little as you just need a new gasket, or you have a bigger problem. We suggest taking the riser off and taking a look inside, which leads us into the next sign. The riser and your manifold have 2 ports. In the center you have your exhaust port. Around the edges or to the outside in a dry joint manifold you have your water ports. There should never be signs of rust or moisture in your exhaust port in the center. Another sign that it might be time to replace your exhaust parts is that your engine is running a little hotter than normal, or if your port and starboard elbows are measuring at slightly different temperatures. Not always a sign that it has to be replaced, but it's a sign that you need to check. All right, this is how you find the right parts for your motor. We're gonna start with the smallest motor, the 3.0 4-cylinder. The 3.0 was introduced with a multi-piece exhaust manifold. It has end caps on the sides and a multi-piece riser. All of those parts are discontinued now, and it gets replaced with a one-piece manifold. There's actually 2 different part numbers for the replacement manifolds, but the manifold in the box is the same for each. One part number ending in A04 and the other A03. The parts that come with the manifold are slightly different to help make it work for your specific engine. The best way to figure out which manifold is right for your motor is to look it up by serial number on our website, or just give us a call and we'll do it for you. Next up is the 4.3 V6 MerCruiser engine. This motor had a unique series of engines in the late 90s and a little bit into the 2000s, where they had a very special one-piece exhaust system. Some people call it the Batwing exhaust. That's been discontinued. You can't buy the parts anymore, and if you do have them on your boat, you should change them immediately because they are very prone to failure. If you need to replace these parts on your engine, to make things easier, we have a conversion kit listed on our website so that you can get all the parts needed to go from the one-piece style to the new modern 2-piece wet joint kit with one click. All right, so if you already have a 2-piece exhaust system on your 4.3, it's a little easier. The first step is to figure out whether you have a wet joint system or a dry joint system. Wet joint went from the 80s up until about 2002. Starting in 2003 up to about 2010, you had dry joint. The wet joint manifolds had a water jacket right around the exhaust jacket. For the dry joint manifolds, Mercury moved the water ports a little farther away from the exhaust port, just in case there's a failure. Now the water won't come back into your motor and destroy it. If you have a dry joint engine, the next thing to figure out is if you have a 7 or 14 degree elbow. The 7-degree elbow was on the earlier dry joint engines from about 2002 to 2004, and 2004 and later, they moved to a slightly taller 14-degree elbow. The easiest way to figure out which elbow, or if you have dry joint at all, is to use our serial number lookup tool or give us a call and we will do it for you. One of the more confusing parts about ordering a new exhaust kit for your 4.3 is making sure you get the right gaskets. Mercury makes 3 types of gaskets. You have a restricted gasket, a full flow gasket, and a block-off gasket. The easiest way to get it right is to make sure you put the same gasket in that you took out. Next, you're going to want to find out if your engine has a spacer between the manifold and the riser elbow. Spacers on wet joint engines could be 3 or 6 inches tall, or you might not have one at all. For dry joint, you might have 1.7, 3-inch, 4.7, or 6-inch tall spacers. Next up, we have our small block V8 MerCruiser engines. This includes the 5.0 liter, 5.7, and the 6.2. The first step in figuring out which parts are correct for your small block V8 is deciding whether you have wet joint or dry joint exhaust. Wet joint exhaust went from the 80s to about 2002, and then in 2003 Mercury switched to dry joint exhaust, which moved the water jacket a little farther away from the exhaust jacket just in case there was a failure so it doesn't destroy your engine. Something to look for when you're trying to figure out if your exhaust is wet or dry joint is these little bulges on the side of the riser. If you look closely, the wet joint riser goes straight down to the manifold. The dry joint riser has these bulges where the exhaust and water jackets separate and come into the manifold. If your engine does have dry joint exhaust, there's two different exhaust elbows possible. For the early motors, about 02 to 04, you have a 7-degree elbow. For the later motors, 04 through about 2010, it's a 14-degree elbow. It's slightly taller than the 7-degree elbow. To make it a little easier to get all of the parts needed to replace your exhaust system on your 5.7, 5.0, or 6.2 engine, we have our small block exhaust kits. We have kits for wet joint and dry joint, and for wet joint we have E-coated and HD, which is hot dip / ceramic coated kits. Our exhaust kits come pre-configured with manifolds and riser elbows and a restricted gasket. That restricted gasket doesn't work for all motors, so make sure you take a look and choose the right gasket for yours. You can also add a spacer kit, some form of gasket, which is what Mercury recommends using on the gaskets, or the water elbows for underneath the manifold on the kit page. If you're unsure of what parts are needed for your motor, just give us a call and we'll walk you through it. Next up is the big block 454 and 502 engines. These engines remained mostly the same from the late 80s until about 2001. Some of your earlier big block engines had a stainless steel riser elbow. Now it's not an obvious polished stainless steel, it's a black painted piece that looks almost exactly like your normal risers. With these stainless riser elbows, they're most of the time reusable. If they're in bad shape, you can replace them with a standard wet joint riser. The only catch is if you have a bracket that mounts your remote oil filter, you're gonna have to relocate it to somewhere inside of the boat. Now, if you have a standard wet joint system with a cast iron riser and manifold, it's pretty easy on the big block. The parts are almost all the same. Our exhaust kit is gonna come pre-selected with manifolds, risers, and restricted gaskets. Make sure your engine has those restricted gaskets before ordering. It's switchable to full flow or block off if needed. Next, you want to check and see if you have a 3 or 6 inch spacer. You may have no spacer at all. Every engine is different and the serial number actually doesn't tell us this information, so you have to physically check. Last, we have the 8.1 496. This motor's pretty simple when it comes to exhaust parts. Starting with the risers, there's two different riser elbows, an 8.5 inch tall and 10.5 inch tall. These elbows almost never go bad. They're stainless steel. If they're not cracked and leaking water, you do not have to replace them. The manifolds, on the other hand, are cast iron just like the other motors. They should be replaced every 5 to 7 years. When you're buying a new manifold for this motor, keep in mind there's two different part numbers. One for just the manifold and one for what they call a water rail conversion kit. This was originally made to convert early model motors to have the newer style exhaust. But the parts in the kit are what you're gonna need regardless of what year your motor is. And you get about $150 worth of parts for free by buying the kit instead of just the manifold because they're almost the same price. In some cases, your 496 might have a 6 inch spacer between the manifold and the riser elbow. This is a cast part and is typically replaced whenever the manifold is replaced. Now that we've covered every model of engine, there's one last thing to talk about. What brand of parts do we suggest using? And as you know, we here at Powerboat Supply and New Wave Marine are platinum level Mercury Marine dealers. For exhaust parts especially, we really recommend sticking with OEM. These parts are manufactured to the highest standards, and with something that when it does fail can ruin your motor, you really don't want to stray from the absolute best. There's not even a big price difference, so a couple hundred extra bucks here could save you thousands in the long run. Thank you so much for watching. Again, I'm Nick from PowerboatSupply.com and New Wave Marine. If you like this content, hit the like button and throw us a follow. We have a lot more to come.